What if the dead didn't stay dead, because war still needed them? In the blood-soaked autumn of 1348, as the Black Death swept across Europe like the scream of a vengeful god, something far more terrifying than disease began to stir beneath the soil. This is not just a story of pestilence. It is a tale of forbidden history, of mercenaries who made an unholy pact to turn death into their greatest weapon. In the shattered kingdoms of Bohemia, where gold bought armies and faith was buried under plague pits, a new kind of soldier was born, undead, unyielding, and unforgiving. They were called the mortuari. They did not fight for kings. They did not serve the church. They fought for death itself. This was Europe's darkest chapter, where war became ritual and the plague became prophecy. What you are about to witness is not written in history books. These are the cursed verses etched into bone, whispered through the ages by those who survived and those who didn't. They buried him in a pit of fire and fever among the rotting bodies of the men he once commanded. By all rights, Captain William Vanug of Flanders should have died that night in October of 1348, just another name lost to the Black Death's relentless tally. But something in the dark listened, something old, hungry, and patient. And when Vanug whispered the words, "If I cannot live to fight, then let me die to fight better," the world changed. That moment marked the first documented case of a phenomenon so blasphemous that even the Inquisition dared not name it. A man who did not return from the dead, because he had never truly left. This was no resurrection. It was a reassignment. The fire of his fever didn't consume him. It reshaped him. According to fragments preserved in the forbidden archives of Saga Abbey, his corpse rose just after the witching hour. His eyes burned with yellow fire, his skin drawn tight like ancient parchment, and the plague sores that covered his body glistened like cursed rubies in the moonlight. The others, those who had been dumped beside him, still gasping their last, witnessed it. Some screamed, others prayed. One tried to flee. None succeeded. Vanug spoke not like a man, but like something buried beneath centuries of silence. And the words he offered were not a plea. They were a command. "Brothers, I have seen the truth. Death is not the end. It is the gate to power." What followed is one of the most disturbing examples of weaponized plague magic in recorded history, with knowledge he could not have known hours before. Vanug conducted the first plague ritual. He mixed infected blood with soil taken from an ancient battlefield, one where Roman blades once tore through screaming tribesmen. He fed it to his dying soldiers. And as the last warmth drained from their veins, they did not go cold. They came back. Stronger, wronger, still them, but not. These were not zombies. They were conscious, cruel, and fully aware of the agony they had endured, and they hungered to share it. This was the beginning of the mortuari, the beginning of an army that did not march for land or gold, but for entropy itself. Eyewitnesses, few who lived, spoke of their strength. A dozen could take a castle. They did not eat, did not sleep, did not stop, and wherever they passed, the plague bloomed like black roses in the blood-soaked snow. But what made them truly horrifying wasn't just their endurance. It was the intelligence. They remembered tactics. They flanked, baited, encircled. They learned. And with each life they took, their power grew, not just in numbers, but in understanding. Death had become their battlefield, and they were mastering it. Reports from mercenary bands hired to stop them say Vanug's soldiers could sense fear, track a heartbeat through fog, and even predict an ambush minutes before it happened. They were soldiers not of the body, but of the threshold, and yet they spoke. One survivor from Kutna Hora described a moment burned into his mind forever. One of them, his jaw hanging open like rotted wood, turned to me and in perfect French said, "You'll thank me when it's over. The living suffer more." That line still appears in church graffiti across Bohemia to this day. It wasn't a war, it was a doctrine. The first 10 mortuarii spread outward like wildfire, not in legions, but in whispers. Villages fell in silence. Castles were taken without siege. There was no trumpet, no banner, only rot, ritual, and return. And Vanug, once a captain forgotten by history, became something more than a man, less than a god, and exactly what the age demanded. A general of the undead, undefeated, unholy. The church never canonized the fallen who fought him. They feared naming him more than they feared the plague itself. And so his title survives only in hushed tones. The first reborn, the mouth of the pit. But we remember, and we begin here. Because this wasn't just the story of one cursed captain. This was the infection of an idea. The moment death became policy, the pit he rose from didn't just hold corpses. It held the blueprint for a new kind of warfare. And William Vanug was only the first to follow it. They called themselves soldiers, but they had become something else. When the mortuary emerged from the plague pit outside Kutna-Hora, they did not march under banners or trumpet their return. They moved like a shadow through rotting wheat fields and fog-choked forests, wordless and unstoppable. The first 10 were once men, mercenaries, thieves, deserters. Now they were vessels, carriers of something older than death. The transformation they endured was not a blessing, nor was it entirely a curse. It was a transaction. Their mortality was stripped, and in its place came clarity without mercy, hunger without end, obedience without question. Willem Vanug led them across the borderlands of Bohemia like a priest, carrying infection instead of scripture. Every step they took was calculated. Every village they passed through left sterilized by flame and silence. Those they did not kill were driven mad by what they witnessed. Eyewitness accounts describe soldiers who bled smoke when wounded, whose breath froze in midair, and whose touch withered skin like fire. But even more horrifying than their physical changes was their resilience. A mortuary could take a dozen arrows, lose an arm, or be run through by a sword, and still keep fighting. Not because they ignored pain, but because they no longer registered the body as human. Pain was a memory. Their nerves had been repurposed, every sensation redirected to sharpen focus and fuel aggression. In rare moments when they spoke, it was in languages they should not have known. One Bohemian farmer described a soldier mumbling in Old Latin, quoting passages from funerary rites no longer in use. Another whispered scripture in reverse, reciting each word as blood oozed from his eyes. They weren't just diseased, the farmer later said. They were possessed by memory itself. The process by which Vanug created his company became codified within weeks. Surviving fragments from the Codex Decay describe it in gruesome detail. Step 1. Extract plague blood from a dying host at the precise moment of spirit separation. Step 2. Mix with ash and soil taken from battlefields where thousands fell. Step 3. Force feed the infected mixture to the subject under a lunar eclipse or a death moon. The ritual only succeeded 1 in 5 times. But when it worked, the result was undeniable. These warriors became more than undead. They were tacticians, trackers, executioners. Their eyes adapted to complete darkness. Their ears could detect the breath of sleeping men from beyond stone walls. They could smell sickness, hear lies, and sense approaching death like hounds of the void. In their presence, crops failed, candles died, and iron rusted before dawn. What made them even more dangerous was their psychological warfare. Entire garrisons surrendered not after battle, but after dreams. Soldiers stationed in nearby cities reported shared nightmares of black-armored figures pulling them down into pits filled with bones and screaming mouths. One commander slit his own throat before the mortuary ever arrived. leaving behind a message scratched into the stone floor. They are not men. They are punishment. Those who survived combat against them described the mortuary as moving in impossible synchrony. Without speaking, they flanked, encircled, and hunted like a hive mind. If one saw you, all knew. If one died, the others did not break formation. They absorbed the tactics of their fallen instantly. According to a captured scribe, their battle instinct was distributed thought. Warfare evolved beyond the need for speech or hesitation. Willem Vanug had created the first cursed combat doctrine, a fully autonomous death machine made of human ruin. He wasn't leading a squad. He was conducting a symphony of decomposition. But perhaps the most terrifying truth was this: they didn't fight for victory. They fought to infect the idea of defeat, to prove that death was not the worst possible outcome. Survival was. And that is why they always left one alive, to tell the story, to spread the fear, to carry the seed. They called it the Plague Forge, but it was not a place where metal was shaped. It was where death was made useful. Hidden beneath the crumbled remains of a monastery outside Brno, the forge pulsed like a wound in the ground. It wasn't built, it was grown, layered over centuries of rot, sacrifice, and whispered prayers to gods long buried. The mortuary didn't just fight with swords. They created weapons that were part relic, part curse, and part memory, each one born screaming into a world already too far gone. According to the tortured account of Pavel, a blacksmith captured and forced to work in the forge before his escape. They blindfolded me before entry, but I could smell it. The place reeked of burned marrow and old sorrow. At the forge's heart sat a pit, a bottomless cavity fed with the corpses of plague victims and the remains of battlefield dead. This was not fuel. It was communion. The flames burned a sickly green, and the heat had no warmth. It clawed at the soul, not the skin. Every weapon forged here was baptized in corruption. Steel was quenched not in water, but in the blood of the infected, while they still breathed. Pavel described how the dying were held down, screaming, as molten blades were plunged through their chests. And somehow, the screaming didn't echo. It fused. The sound, the soul, the terror. They became part of the weapon itself. They made a warhammer, Pavel whispered in his written confession, and it laughed every time it struck. This was not metaphor. The weapons spoke, not in words, but in pulses, groans in the hand, heat in the hilt, whispers in the ear of the wielder. The longer one held them, the more they bled back. These were weapons that remembered. Their edges retained pain like a fingerprint. Their weight changed with hunger, and when swung in battle, some left behind not wounds, but memories. The most infamous of these tools became known as the Reaper's Arsenal, a soul-bound armory crafted for no other purpose than to harvest and enslave. Its pieces were each designed for a different kind of soul. The Confessor's blade could rip final thoughts from the dying, offering intelligence pulled straight from a victim's last breath. The Martyr's mace trapped the spirits of religious fanatics and warped their faith into blind rage, using their belief as a weapon against their own cause. The innocent dagger, arguably the most abominable, was reserved for children and non-combatants. Their purity made the energy more potent, their souls more pliable. Every blade was etched while still hot, carved not with chisels but with tools made from the bones of plague victims, shaped with runes that predated Rome, spirals stolen from Celtic altars, sigils once painted in gladiators' blood. These symbols weren't just for show, they were bindings. Each stroke imprisoned a soul, and every soul added precision, malice, and voice. The forge didn't make weapons. It made prisoners, and then gave them purpose. One of the most devastating pieces was the Soul Flayer, a massive executioner's axe that, when swung, did not just sever limbs but unraveled the identities of those it touched. Survivors of battle spoke of men forgetting their names, crying like infants, or vanishing altogether as if erased from memory. To die by the blade was mercy. To survive it was torment. These weapons weren't mass-produced. They were sculpted, each one a bespoke curse, made for a specific wielder, with a specific function. To wield one required not just strength, but a willingness to be changed by it. Pavel described a soldier who had used the same sword for 6 campaigns. By the end, the man no longer slept. He no longer spoke. He stared at his reflection, Pavel wrote, and the sword blinked back. The Plague Forge was not just a workshop. It was a theology, a place where death could be customized, sharpened, and given direction. And as the mortuary expanded their reach, so too did their arsenal. Each weapon they forged wasn't just a tool, it was a message, a scream turned solid, a curse shaped for the hand, and every time it was used, the forge remembered and smiled. If the soldiers of the mortuary were nightmare-given flesh, then the cherubs were nightmare-wearing the face of innocence, small, soft-voiced, wide-eyed, and utterly lethal. Among all the horrors birthed from the Plague Forge, none disturbed the human soul more than the plague-born children. They were called cherubs, not in affection, but in mockery. They were not angels. They were engineered abominations, and they were terrifyingly effective. According to the smuggled diary of Sister Agatha, a nun who infiltrated one of the plague camps disguised as a healer, the children were the worst. They still laughed, they still played, but their laughter never reached their eyes. The mortuary had discovered early on that the younger the host, the more adaptable the corruption. Children infected during key stages of development didn't just survive the plague, they evolved with it. They absorbed it. And what emerged on the other side was not quite human, not entirely spirit, but something uniquely cruel. These weren't undead in the traditional sense. Their hearts beat, their blood flowed, but it pulsed with blackened ichor, thick and hot and wrong. They retained their memories, homes, siblings, lullabies, but their emotions inverted. They felt joy in pain, curiosity in cruelty, and calm in the presence of death. The mortuary called them plague cherubs. Sister Agatha called them crawling blasphemies. They moved like insects, climbing walls, scuttling across ceilings, folding their limbs in ways that defied anatomy. Their eyes adapted to the dark, their bones hollowed to reduce weight, and their fingernails calcified into razor-sharp talons capable of slicing through leather and chainmail. They were designed for infiltration, for sabotage, for assassination, and they were devastatingly good at it. Towns would fall without a single adult mortuary crossing the threshold. Wells would be poisoned. Guards would be murdered in their sleep. No one ever suspected the child playing in the square was there to gut the mayor before dawn. The process of creating a plague cherub was more ritual than science. Orphans were selected from plague-ravaged villages, children who had already witnessed the death of everyone they loved. The logic was simple. A broken spirit was easier to reshape. Over several months, they were fed corrupted milk, bread from diseased animals. Their bread was made from grain grown in graveyard soil. Their water was laced with diluted plague blood. They didn't scream. They adapted. They learned to mimic human behavior perfectly. But behind the mimicry was nothing. A hollow hunger. A silence where empathy should have been. One child, Sister Agatha noted, recited a full breakdown of city defenses, including guard shifts, sewer access, and structural weaknesses at age 7. She asked him how he knew. He replied, smiling, "I asked the rats." Their voices remained soft, their minds ancient. The psychological horror of the cherubs was unmatched. One bishop in Prague described them as the death of parenthood itself. To see a child and not feel hope, but dread, that was what the mortuary wanted. They turned the most sacred symbol of life into a weapon of corruption. But perhaps most disturbing was the reverence the mortuary showed them. In the forges, they were treated not as tools, but as prophets. Some believed they were the next stage of humanity, born not from wombs, but from plague, fire, and intent, and in battle, they were deployed sparingly, like artifacts too rare to risk, but devastating when used. They whispered commands. They tore through lines. They smiled while entire regiments bled out. One surviving soldier, when interrogated after fleeing a burning town, could only sob and repeat one phrase. The baby laughed when he killed my captain. It giggled. It had no eyes. Whatever the cherubs were, they weren't meant to survive the plague. They were born of it, shaped by it. And in their smile lived a silence deeper than any grave. And the worst part? Some of them are never accounted for. As towns burned and the mortuary scattered, some children simply vanished into the woods, still small, still smiling, still waiting. Faith was not immune to the plague. It was the first to fall. While villages burned and saints lay rotting in the streets, the mortuary crafted their own theology, not in chapels or scripture, but in bone and blood. They didn't reject religion. They inverted it. What began as a war cult evolved into something darker, a belief system built on entropy, communion, and the sacred act of decay. It was known simply as the communion, and it was the most powerful ritual in their arsenal, according to interrogation records recovered from Father Tomas, a defrocked priest who had joined the mortuary before being captured in Prague. The communion took place every night at the witching hour, but there was no wine, no chalice, only a trough of blood, fresh, infected, unrepentant. The host was not bread but powdered bone, often from executed enemies or plague martyrs, mixed with ash and dried flesh. The ritual space was never random. It had to be sanctified through desecration, altars cracked open with axes, icons defiled, candles lit with human fat. They didn't hide it. They celebrated it. They said they weren't mocking Christ. Thomas wrote, "They said they were completing him." Those who partook of the communion were not merely nourished. They were networked. Something happened when they drank, a surge of shared thought, of ancient knowledge, of collective emotion that defied explanation. What one soldier knew, all knew. What one saw, all saw. They moved together like wolves on the hunt, except wolves don't share memories. These warriors did. One mortuary knight killed in battle was found with no visible wounds, but on his flesh were scars in patterns that mirrored those of 12 others who had died that same day, miles apart. Pain, it seemed, could travel across the blood. This was not faith. This was infrastructure. It allowed them to fight without commanders, to adapt without hesitation, to replace strategy with instinct. They became a hive mind of holy rot, each warrior a neuron in a brain of war. "We are many," one whispered before his execution, "but we remember as one." The communion was more than communication. It was communion with the dead. When a soldier partook, they were said to hear the voices of every mortuary who had ever died: tacticians, berserkers, plague children, echoing inside their skull like prayers carved into stone. But not just voices, skills, languages, memories. Entire battle doctrines could be passed through a sip. Some even claimed they could speak with the spirits of their enemies, pulling secrets from the dead as easily as drawing blood. One horrifying detail emerged during Thomas's trial. The mortuary did not fear death because it only added to their strength. The more they killed, the more their communion grew. Each victim's soul became a lesson, a library, a whisper in the dark. They did not discard the dead, they harvested them. The ritual was not without cost. Repeated participation in the communion changed a soldier's body. Skin grew pale, veins blackened, eyes lost all color except a faint, unnatural glow. But the greater change was spiritual. Mercy faded, compassion rotted, love became unrecognizable. What remained was a hunger, not for food or even violence, but for unity, for absorption, for absolution through infection. One defector claimed the communion made him forget his wife's name, his son's voice, but he remembered how 100 strangers died on the fields of Tabor, and he remembered their tactics perfectly. The ritual spread quickly. It was efficient, adaptable, viral. New recruits didn't need training. They only needed to kneel, drink, and forget who they were. The mortuary didn't recruit with gold. They recruited with communion, with memory, with the promise of never being alone again. In a world where death had become policy, they offered eternal fraternity, brotherhood beyond the grave. And the most terrifying part? It worked. No other army in medieval Europe had their cohesion, their precision, their speed of adaptation, because no other army had replaced free will with a single, pulsating mind of plague. They didn't just share orders. They shared purpose. They shared hunger. They shared silence. And they shared it well. It began with a circle of corpses, not soldiers, not catapults, not siege towers, just the dead, laid out in patterns too precise to be chance. Geometric wounds carved into the soil. The city of Olomouc had withstood plague, famine, and fire, but nothing prepared it for the siege of souls, the mortuary's most ambitious, blasphemous, and apocalyptic campaign. They weren't trying to conquer the city. They were trying to erase its soul. At first, no one noticed. A few travelers vanished on the road. Candles wouldn't light near the cathedral. Children stopped dreaming. Then came the nightmares. Shared visions of black-robed children crawling through windows, of weeping statues, of blood running uphill. The clergy called it mass hysteria. The army called it nerves. But Bishop Arnost knew better. "It wasn't what we saw," he wrote. "It was what we felt, like the ground wanted us gone." On the first night, they sent the cherubs, dozens of them, laughing, climbing, cutting. The city lost a quarter of its garrison before dawn, and not a single wall had been breached. The cherubs melted back into the night, their work done, their whispers lingering in every empty crib and blood-soaked pillow. Then came the rot. Wells turned black. Grain sprouted worms. Livestock screamed until their throats split open, but the walls still stood. The people prayed harder. On the 7th night, the walls wept, literally. Blood leaked from the mortar. The stones began to hum with voices. And then the dead rose, but they weren't attacking from outside. They were already inside, buried in the cemeteries, the catacombs, the basements. Families found ancestors clawing at the floorboards. One man's wife rose from her funeral pyre and strangled him with her own rosary. The mortuary didn't need to invade. They awakened the city's dead and turned them against the living. Their goal was singular, to transform Olomouc into a permanent necromantic battery, a living altar powered by grief and spiritual collapse. And to do that, they needed one final act, the relic. Hidden beneath the cathedral's high altar was a splinter of the true cross, protected for centuries, untouched even by fire or reform. It was the last anchor keeping the veil between worlds intact. The mortuary intended to use it as a key. All they needed was fuel, the souls of 100 innocents sacrificed in unison. Bishop Arnost and a handful of defenders made their stand that night, not with swords, but with chants, salt, and desperation. As the ritual began, the sky turned black. Not dark, black. Ink poured from the stars. The relic began to scream, not metaphorically, audibly. a sound like burning ice, like forgotten names crying to be remembered. And then it cracked. What happened next is still debated. But what's consistent in every surviving account is this: the relic rejected the corruption. Instead of opening a gateway to the dead, it erupted, sending out a blast of holy energy so violent that it vaporized every mortuary within the walls, turned screaming cherubs to ash, and reduced the cathedral's spire to molten slag. Survivors wept not in victory, but in shock. It wasn't salvation, one wrote. It was divine recoil, a rejection so pure it couldn't be contained. The mortuary had failed, but not because they were stopped, because the one thing they could not corrupt fought back. Still, the price was unimaginable. Thousands dead. The city half buried in bone and ruin. Those who lived would never sleep soundly again, and among the rubble, scattered like teeth, were weapons that still whispered, still breathed. For decades, the ground around Olomouc remained cursed. Priests sent to bless the city lost their voices. Crops grew in the shape of runes, and children born within the walls were blind, but spoke in Latin. The siege of souls was over, but its echo had only just begun. Because what the mortuary failed to open that night still waits. The church did not win, it merely survived. In the aftermath of Olomouc, inquisitors swept across Bohemia, burning archives, consecrating mass graves, and silencing witnesses. The official doctrine was simple. The mortuary never existed. But folk songs tell another story. So do the scars on cursed ground, and so do the weapons hidden beneath monasteries, blades that still twitch under moonlight, whispering in a tongue no one should speak. The mortuary didn't vanish. They adapted. Their rituals became myth. Their theology, heresy, their communion, a whisper in the minds of those who still feel drawn to the dark. And maybe that's the point. Maybe their real goal wasn't conquest, but infection of memory, a belief system not carried in scrolls or swords, but in nightmares, in stories passed through firelight, in the fear that some deaths do not end. Because if war is a cycle and death is a doctrine, then who truly wins? Some battles aren't fought for land or glory, but for the shape of history itself. So tell me, what part of this story still echoes in you? If this tale disturbed you, or made you question where horror ends and history begins, then don't let it vanish like forbidden scripture. Comment below. Tell us what you believe. Save this video. Share it with someone who still thinks the past is just the past. And if you want to see what else they buried, subscribe. Because this is only one chapter in the war between death and denial.